If you were asked how much faith it might take to command a tree to be uprooted and planted in the sea and have it do so, how much faith would that take? Jesus answers this question in a parable he puts forth in Luke chapter 17, verses 5 to 6. And he states that it is faith the size of a mustard seed. That is, faith about the width of a pencil tip, a ballpoint pen, the tip of a needle, the legs of a millipede, mosquito eggs, a baby's first milk teeth, or many sands of grain. About 1 to 2 millimeters. That's how much faith it would take to accomplish such a deed. Now this, of course, is not what Jesus is getting at. But here, exploring this passage, we get a sense of what Jesus does indeed have to say about genuine faith and the unexpected miraculous things that it can accomplish. So thanks for joining us in this study of Luke 17, verses 5 to 6. This parable takes place in a flow of 4 teachings that Jesus gives, all in parabolic form, to begin Luke chapter 17. And in the first 3 of these, this is the third again, in the first 3 of these, Jesus utilizes some rather strong language, extreme language, to capture people's attention and really drive home the point that he's trying to make. And so too, in this short discourse on faith, he employs what might be regarded as outrageous imagery to indeed convey the outrageous effects that true faith can have in life. Now, these brief comments on faith may follow naturally from the verses that precede them. Some people take these 4 teachings in the beginning of Luke 17 as independently, as just a collection of sayings that Jesus gave at different times. But it's worth reading Luke 17 verses 3 to 4 as well, where he teaches about the necessity of forgiveness. How even if a brother sins against one 7 times in a day and 7 times repents, one must forgive such a brother. It may naturally impel the listeners to ask Jesus, Lord, increase our faith. Give us more faith so that we can do such things as you ask us to do. For indeed, it might take incredible faith to forgive one genuinely in such circumstances. But let's read together verses 5 and 6 and hear the parable on its own and see what Jesus is saying here. The apostles said to the Lord, increase our faith. The Lord replied, if you had faith the size of a mustard seed, you could say to this mulberry tree, be uprooted and planted in the sea, and it would obey you. Now, a few quick notes are helpful in identifying what exactly Jesus is speaking of to make plain some of the imagery at play here. The first is that Jesus speaks of a mustard seed. If one had faith the size of a mustard seed, or if one had faith as a mustard seed, like a mustard seed, one could command such a thing and so forth. A mustard seed was, in Jesus' time, it was proverbially small. As mentioned at the beginning of the video, a mustard seed is very tiny, about 1 to 2 millimeters across, and it's even difficult to see with the naked eye, say at arm's length. And this mustard seed could be pointed out as perhaps the smallest thing that exists, just a very, very, very tiny thing. And Jesus, in fact, uses a mustard seed, the imagery of a mustard seed, in several other very similar teachings. In Matthew 17 and 21, as well as in Mark 13, Jesus teaches a very similar story about if one had simply the faith the size of a mustard seed, one could, in those circumstances, command a mountain to move from here to there, or a mountain could be picked up and cast into the sea. So Jesus is making a very similar point on the power of just a tiny, tiny bit of faith in those other settings as well. And too, in Luke 13, Jesus compares the kingdom of God to a mustard seed. That the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed, he says in this parable, that though it's the smallest of all seeds, it grows up into a great bush or a great tree, and birds come and make nests in its branches. So Jesus elsewhere employs a mustard seed to indicate something very, very small, as it was elsewhere proverbially used at this time. And two, in this figure of speech, Jesus employs a mulberry tree. Now, it must be admitted that what exact species this mulberry tree is referring to is a little uncertain. It could well be a sycamine tree, A sycamine tree grows maybe 30 or 40 feet. It's a black mulberry tree, and was very common in Palestine at this time of Jesus telling this parable. So too, however, it could possibly be referring to a sycamore tree. A sycamore tree would be higher, taller, about 60 feet up to, and would also have been renowned for its very large and extensive root structure. And if sycamore is intended, Jesus could be also employing a kind of a proverb of his time, drawing on such a great tree with very deep roots that would be very hard of itself just to pick up, let alone to plant in the sea. I remember one time, actually, when I was a boy, I was out at my friend's lake cabin, and his mother out in front of the cabin was trying to dig up a tree, the root system of a tree that had existed there in the front yard. And probably not being able to hire someone to come all the way out there with a stump grinder. They were trying to do it by hand. And I remember, if you've never tried this before, how difficult indeed it can be to try to pull out a tree by its roots. And if a sycamore tree, this would have been doubly, triply, quadruply difficult. And this is just to emphasize the unbelievableness of what Jesus is communicating here about just a little bit of faith. Now, the difficulty in translation here, for those interested, comes down to the Greek words being employed behind this. There is a sycaminos, which is properly translated as a sycamine tree, and this sycaminos is indeed what is used in Luke here in chapter 17. However, there is also a close approximation of this word, sycamorea, which is typically translated as sycamore. And the difficulty is that the old Hebrew word of shikmin could be translated either way. And in fact, in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, sycamine was used for this word, which is commonly translated as sycamore. And so there is some uncertainty in translation about what exact type of tree Jesus is speaking of in this parable. And as such, one might see in various Bible translations various renderings of this word. In fact, just checking a few out, it is listed as sycamine, as sycamore, mulberry, black mulberry, or the NLV translates it just simply as tree, probably to avoid these difficulties of translating this particular word. But for us readers today, the exact type of tree probably isn't all that important. Whether a large tree or a very large tree, the sense is just about the same, of a tiny amount of faith being able to accomplish such an incredible thing. And through the rest of this parable, the words uprooted, planted, and see are all what one might expect. That is, Jesus is communicating just what we might expect him to be saying in the rest of this parable. That if one had just the tiniest bit of faith, one could command a tree to be uprooted and replanted in the sea, and it would obey you. Jesus is saying here with all of his characteristic imagination and shock and surprise that having faith, just the smallest bit of it, is able to accomplish what is seemingly impossible. And looping back to the beginning of this parable, the apostles asked the Lord, "Lord, increase our faith." They're not necessarily asking for the gift of faith itself, but they're asking for its increase, its growth or expansion within themselves. And here a couple interpretations can diverge about what exactly Jesus is intending to mean about faith in this parable through this teaching. And one approach is to posit that Jesus' point here is that even the smallest bit of faith, that exercising that genuine faith is all that is needed. That is, it is not the amount or the size of faith that is important, but one can simply trust on that small bit that one does have. Such is the power of faith in God and of the kingdom of God. And so it's rather an encouragement to draw upon, to rely upon and press forward in and through the faith that one already has. And alternatively, in this teaching on faith, Jesus could also be rebuking his disciples for their lack of faith, saying that they don't really have much of any faith. And even if they had just this tiniest observable bit, these great things would be possible. And there is plenty of scriptural support for this latter interpretation. as Jesus routinely critiques both the people and the disciples for their lack of faith or their smallness of faith. He speaks of their oligopistis, from which we get the word oligarchy, the few or the little faith. And importantly, of note, and what can help us to perhaps interpret this passage in Luke 17, 5-6 well, in Matthew 17, a man comes to Jesus asking that he would heal his epileptic son, and that his disciples have been unable to do so. And Jesus heals the boy. The disciples then come and ask Jesus why they were not able to heal the child. He said to them, "Because of your little faith. For truly I tell you, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you." And the suggestion here in Matthew 17 is that if the disciples had faith, or had even the tiniest bit of faith, they could affect such a healing or even greater things than this. And either way that it's taken, Jesus is undeniably communicating the great power inherent in having faith. And that, as one commentator put it, genuine faith can accomplish what experience, reason, and probability might deny. And that great and unimaginable things might be seen from just a little bit of faith in God. We warmly invite you to subscribe to this channel for future videos, the next one of which will be on Luke 17, verses 7-10, which is a continuation of this set of parables discussing how to be a faithful servant. So thank you for joining us on this video of the importance and the dramatic effects of genuine faith, and may God bless you today.